The Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War had some huge challenges. They had difficulty getting arms and ammunition. They had difficulty getting uniforms. They had difficulty getting enough shelter, enough tents. But one of the largest difficulties was feeding the army. How do you procure the food? How do you distribute it and get it to the soldiers? And how do the soldiers cook it? With all these challenges, whether it's having enough uniform or enough shelter, these issues would be much easier to deal with if you had enough food. So what was the soldier's typical ration? What was he supposed to get? In this 18th century context, even into the 19th century context, it's pretty similar. It's supposed to be about a pound of beef, maybe salt, maybe fresh, or if you're going to substitute pork, maybe 3/4 of a pound. It might also be a pound of fish. Now that's per man per day. Also, there was a bread portion of the ration. That might be regular bread, hard bread like ship's biscuit, or even just flour, and again, a pound per day. Now, early on in the Revolutionary War, they also had a liquid portion of their ration. This sort of disappears later on. They don't talk about it much. And that would be a quart of beer, or possibly a quart of cider, or a ration of molasses so they could make their own beer. There were other rations that were listed as per man per week, so items that they wouldn't get nearly as much of, and that might be rice, it might be vinegar, it possibly would be butter or cornmeal. Now, many of the soldiers' journals and memoirs talk about basically them never receiving those kinds of rations, that they were lucky to get just the meat and the bread portion of that ration. During World War II, the American Army calculated that the average soldier should take in 4,000 to 4,500 calories per day just to stay nominal. However, in a modern sense, when we calculate the ration of a soldier in the 18th century and we look at what they've got, whether it was the full ration, complete meat, bread, even some of these other things, we only get to 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day, depending on the variation of the meat portion or what kind of bread they're getting. So we know these soldiers are not getting enough food, even if they get their full ration. If we read the memoir of Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier during the Revolutionary War, it seems like about half the book he's talking about not having any food at all, or the food is bad or not enough. You would think from his memoirs that soldiers never got enough of their ration. Now, of course, soldiers did many times get their proper ration, but we do have not just Joseph Plum Martin, but many soldiers and officers during the time period talking about the lack of rations, the times when they had to change the rations, they had to substitute, they had to give them half rations, whatever it was. And it was a known thing that they weren't able to supply the soldiers with all the food that they were supposed to be getting. So what is the best case scenario for the American Revolutionary War soldier? If he gets his full ration of fresh beef, he gets a pound of beef, and he gets a pound of bread, and maybe he gets some small ration of peas. That's another one of those per week ration. They might get a 1/4 cup of peas per day. He would have a piece of equipment like this. He would have a cook pot, and he would make a stew. And this is the kind of cooking that they really suggested. All the officers and everyone else, you should make a stew. That's the best way of getting all the nutrition possible from your food ration. So they encouraged this. They had very few other utensils, but they were supposed to be issued a cook pot, something like this one. The rations were given out in a 6-man squad situation, so 6 men are going to eat out of this pot. If they're fortunate, if they're in an ideal circumstance, they might have more than one bowl in their inventory. If they didn't have that, they might have to eat right out of the pot. And if they're also fortunate, they've got a few utensils, maybe a couple of spoons or a cooking knife. But more than likely, they had to work with the regular jackknives that they might have in their pocket. And this stew that they've made, this is breakfast, it is lunch, it is supper. It's all the food you're going to get. Unfortunately, there was a great shortage of not only food, but of the actual utensils to cook it with. So the cook pots, they were in short supply. They had poor quality ones given to them, they would wear out quickly. And these cook pots, the soldiers had to carry along with them. If you're on the march, you were not supposed to put your cook pot on the wagon along with the tents. You had to carry that. And you would carry that with whatever food you had with you. You'd carry it in the cook pot, possibly yesterday's meal cooked in it, or a meal that's supposed to last you 3 or 4 days on the march. There was also a shortage of eating utensils. There were times that the men were issued spoons, plates, or bowls, maybe even cups, but the vast majority of the time, the soldiers probably had to make do with a very few of those, or ones that they brought along with them or made along the way. Soldiers are often driven to the extremity of making their own utensils, using the simple tools they have at hand, simple jackknives and tomahawks. They create simple wooden bowls, plates, and spoons. Water definitely would be another difficulty. They're not bringing along water with them in any shape or form, so you're going to have to find water as close as you can to camp and bring it in your very own camp kettle or your canteen. If you're in a garrison setting, in a fort, something that's more stable, they might issue cast iron pots instead. There were times when cast iron pots were issued early on in the war to regular soldiers, but they were so heavy to carry, the soldiers would just leave them along the way and keep going without them. The lack of other utensils is documented in multiple situations where if you have to carry a bunch of food, they might use just a board, and people might eat off of a board or a piece of bark. All these sound like crazy stories, but they're right there in the documentation, and the different soldiers, multiple different soldiers, talking about these kinds of situations. There were many substitutes they used for the rations that were not available at the time. So the main meat ration is 1 pound of beef, but they could substitute 1 pound of salt beef. There were times when that was actually requested because salt beef will work on a march where fresh beef won't. It will go bad within a day or two. If you're on the march, you want something that won't rot. So a salt beef ration would be better, or you might get a salt pork ration, or even a salt fish ration. Now, I'm not sure how palatable a salt fish ration is, but it seems like that wasn't a very rare substitute. There were other meats also that might show up at times. In the documentations, there were times when the butchers were working with just sheep. That was all they could get a hold of, so you might get a pound of mutton instead. The fresh meat ration was sometimes given in such a large quantity, say for 4 or 5 days, that the army was concerned that the meat would go bad. And so the soldiers either had to cook it up front, or they had to salt the meat to last just that a period of time. Not a full salting, but a partial salting. And there were times when the army tried to issue salt for that very purpose. Bread was also a huge issue. Now, fresh bread does not last very long. If you think about trying to feed an army of 1,000 men and you need to come up with 1,000 pounds of bread a day, you have to bake 1,000 pounds of bread a day. That's not easy to do in the circumstances. So the army really tried a bunch of different things for bread, and most of them didn't work. There were kind of official army bakers, but it never caught on to a great extent. And so most of the time this was done by contractors. They would try to find somebody in the communities around there to bake the bread for the soldiers. This was a constant problem. Even if you got 1,000 pounds of bread, how are you going to haul 1,000 pounds of bread a day? You have to have wagons to haul it. You don't have a good way to store it. It gets smashed. So bread was a huge problem, especially on the march. And so officers who were taking their men on the march would request, when possible, to get ship's biscuit. Ship's biscuit is so much easier to carry along the way. It doesn't go bad for months at a time, is very difficult to break. Sort of the third and least desired substitute would be flour, a pound of flour to work with. And that isn't easy to make into a bread by a soldier. They would make fire cakes and ash cakes at times. Any way to turn that into something palatable. They might just put it with their stew and just mix it in there, but that doesn't really give you the tooth of bread. You want the variation of bread in your meal, and that really didn't give it to them. There was even the substitute at times of cornmeal instead of flour. You can imagine these breads and bread substitutes wouldn't be the bread that everyone was expecting, but at least they tried to give them something in the bread portion every day. The Army and the soldiers did their best to supplement the food rations whenever possible. What else can we give the soldiers other than their standard ration? Now, there are times when the soldiers went out and stole what they needed. And Joseph Plum Martin talks about that. There's even a missive from General Washington where he's very displeased about finding out that the soldiers are stealing things, going out into the community and getting whatever they possibly could. So the soldiers might raid gardens or barns, steal livestock, whatever that happens to be. There are multiple references to soldiers just going out into a field of, say, something like turnips and pulling up a bunch of turnips because that's the only food they're going to get that day. In other cases, we see the generosity of the community around the soldiers, giving soldiers what they need, whether they go to a house and look for a bed for the night or a little bit of food. This certainly happens, and we see that in the journals. Vegetables aren't spelled out in the ration like meat or bread, but we do see in other commands from, say, the generals and other officers that whenever possible, giving the soldiers vegetables is what they really need. Joseph Plum Martin would call this sauce. He says, I ate my meal or I ate my meat without sauce. He really means there's nothing else to go along with it, no potatoes or carrots. But the military tried to supply those whenever possible. It was just one of those ad hoc things. You never knew when you were going to get a wagon load of carrots or potatoes, but when you did, you supplied those out to the soldiers. And there were times when there was an officer, he said he went out into a village in search of asparagus, but the soldiers had been there before him and all the asparagus in the village had already been cut. In 1777, George Washington authorizes the foraging of wild vegetables. He says there is plenty of common and French sorrel, lamb's quarter, and watercresses growing about the camp. The general recommends to the soldiers the constant use of them as they make an agreeable salad and have the most salutary effect. The regimental officer of the day to send to gather them every morning and have them distributed among the men. Doing the in-depth research on this topic, it's really obvious that having enough food was a huge problem for the Revolutionary War soldier. And the officers knew it was a problem. Everyone knew it was an issue. And even when they had their full ration, there still wasn't enough food energy in their ration for what these young men needed to fight a war. But they still did it. Joseph Plum Martin was there for the entire war, and he complained over and over again about not having rations for 2 or 3 or 4 days at a time. And yet, he did not throw down his weapon and take off his coat and walk away. He kept on fighting.